By the late 20th century, the United States had officially moved away from the policies that created the Dawes Act, but the consequences of that law were still shaping Native lives in very real ways. Land loss, poverty, and legal confusion did not disappear simply because allotment had ended. They became inherited problems. Many Native families no longer knew where their original allotments had been. Records were scattered, incomplete, or deliberately vague. Some land had passed through dozens of hands. Other parcels remained locked in fractionated ownership, unusable but impossible to reclaim. Tribes spent decades fighting in courts just to prove what had once been clearly theirs. The federal government acknowledged some responsibility, but acknowledgement did not always lead to justice. Lawsuits over mismanaged trust funds revealed that billions of dollars in native land income had been lost or stolen over generations. Settlements came slowly, often without fully repairing the damage. Even so, native nations continued to push forward. Tribal governments strengthened. Casinos and gaming enterprises, made possible by later legislation, provided some tribes with revenue to invest in housing, healthcare, and education. Cultural revival movements restored languages, ceremonies, and traditions once targeted for erasure. But these gains existed alongside ongoing struggles rooted in allotment. Reservation boundaries remained fractured. Jurisdictional confusion made law enforcement difficult. Economic development was uneven, often limited by land status and federal oversight. The promise of sovereignty was still constrained by systems created during the allotment era. The Dawes Act also left a psychological legacy. Generations grew up hearing stories of land taken not by soldiers but by signatures. Trust in government was deeply damaged. Elders taught caution, skepticism, and vigilance. Every new policy was examined through the memory of allotment. Education became a key. As the Dawes Act spread across Indian country, its impact did not arrive all at once. It came reservation by reservation, tribe by tribe, often wrapped in promises that sounded reasonable until it was too late to undo them. Federal agents became the face of the policy. They arrived with surveyors and translators, carrying official authority and quiet threats. Meetings were held where native families were told this was progress, that owning land individually would protect them from further removal. Many were assured that refusing would only delay the inevitable. For people who had already survived forced marches, massacres, and broken treaties, the word inevitable carried weight. Surveyors carved reservations into grids, ignoring rivers, sacred spaces, seasonal migration routes, and traditional land use. The land was measured as property, not as living space. A family might receive land miles away from relatives. Elders were sometimes assigned parcels they could not physically reach. Some allotments were so dry or rocky they could not support crops at all. The government insisted that farming would make Native Americans self-sufficient. What it ignored was that many tribes were not agricultural societies in the European sense. Plains tribes depended on bison. Southwestern tribes practiced complex communal farming adapted to desert environments. Forest tribes hunted, fished, and gathered seasonally. The allotment system assumed one model of life and forced everyone into it. The 25-year trust period was presented as protection. During this time, native landowners technically could not sell their allotments. In reality, this protection was thin. Federal agents controlled leasing. Non-native farmers rented native land at unfair rates. Profits rarely reached the landowners themselves. When the trust period ended, the consequences became brutal. Suddenly, native landowners were subject to state and local taxes. Many had no cash economy and no way to pay. Counties seized. The Great Depression exposed truths the federal government could no longer ignore. As banks collapsed and farms failed across the country, the condition of native reservations stood out as especially severe. Many native families had already lost their land through allotment, taxation, and fraud. Those who still held land often lived on parcels too small or poor to support them. The promises of the Dawes Act had fully unraveled. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and launched what became known as the New Deal. Among the many crises his administration faced was the long-neglected disaster created by federal Indian policy. For the first time in decades, Native issues were placed under serious review. A key figure in this shift was John Collier, appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Collier was deeply critical of assimilation policies. Unlike earlier reformers, he believed Native cultures were not obstacles to progress but valuable ways of life worth protecting. He had studied Native communities, listened to tribal leaders, and concluded that the Dawes Act had caused enormous harm. Under his leadership, the Bureau of Indian Affairs began to change direction. The Merriam Report served as the foundation for reform. Its evidence was undeniable. Allotment had failed economically, socially, and morally. Collier pushed Congress to end the policy and restore tribal self-governance. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, often called the Wheeler-Howard Act. This law effectively ended allotment. No new tribal land would be broken into individual parcels. Remaining surplus lands would no longer be sold off. Tribes were encouraged to re-establish self-governing councils and adopt written constitutions. Federal funds were made available for land purchases to restore some of what had been lost. On paper, it marked a dramatic reversal. In reality, the legacy of the Dawes Act made recovery difficult. By 1934, most of the land was already gone. 90 million. Long before the Dawes Act was written into law, Native American nations already understood what it meant to lose land. By the mid-1800s, the United States had expanded coast to coast. Railroads cut through plains and mountains. Settlers followed soldiers. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten, then ignored. Tribes were pushed onto reservations that were often far from their ancestral homes, placed on land considered useless by white settlers. The official language spoke of peace and protection. The reality was confinement and control. Yet even after removal and the reservation system, Native nations still held something the federal government found unacceptable: communal ownership of land. To Native peoples, land was not property in the European sense. It was not something to be divided, bought, or sold. It was shared by the tribe, cared for across generations, tied to identity, spirituality, and survival. This idea stood in direct conflict with American beliefs about private property, farming, and civilization. By the late 19th century, many white politicians, reformers, and businessmen agreed on one thing. The Indian problem, as they called it, had not been solved. Some wanted Native Americans gone entirely. Others argued for a different approach. Instead of killing Native cultures outright, they would reshape them. This idea was called assimilation. Supporters of assimilation believed Native Americans should abandon tribal life and become farmers, Christians, English speakers, and individual landowners. They claimed this would save Native people. In truth, it would open millions of acres of tribal land to white settlement. One of the loudest voices pushing this vision was Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts. Dawes was not a frontier politician. He had never lived on a reservation. He considered himself a humanitarian. He believed Native Americans could survive only if they adopted American ways completely. "There is no selfishness," Dawes once said.